Life is a series of decisions, decisions which may lead to life or death. We are going to follow the stories of two Jewish families in eastern Poland in 1939, where individual or family decisions resulted in families staying, moving east to the Soviet Union, or migrating to Colombia. Decisions where some perished and others lived to tell their stories. Moises Mermelstein was a child 1 year old in 1939 when the German army invaded Poland on September 1. So Moises Mermelstein was a child 1 year old in 1939 at the time that Germany invaded Poland on September 1st. During this session, Moises, you're going to tell your story of your families in Poland. There are a series of decisions that your families made. Some families lived to tell the story, others, their lives were terminated.
Yes, well, the thing about decisions is that usually everybody makes decisions every day, but they are not terminal decisions. You can always either go back on them or change your mind or do whatever in that sense that you think is good. But in times of war, and this is what is the strange thing about this. In times of war, every decision leads directly to life or death. And I've been thinking about our history at the time when the war broke out in 1939 September, like you said. And maybe if we take a look at that, we can see what I mean by taking decisions in times of war.
Maybe you could say a little now about your mother's family.
The family of my mother, as you mentioned, consisted of 4 siblings. My mother was the oldest one. Then there was a brother called Chaim. My mother's name was Chaye. Then there was a sister called Esther, and finally the youngest one was a sister called Hanne. They were from a town in the southeast of Poland called Krylov, and that town is right on the river Bug.
And the river Bug is the river which separates Poland from...
Yes, it's the river that separates Poland from the Ukraine. At the time when the war broke out in 1939, both parents from my mother's side had died already. And by that time, my mother had married my father Chaim. And at that time, I had been born. I was 1 year old when the war started in 1939. When the war started, when the war broke out, we were living, my mother, my father, myself, in Krylov, which is the town where my mother was born. And that's an interesting story in itself. It happened that there was a Colombian consulate in Warsaw, and they ran an ad once saying that they would give visas to anybody who wanted to come to Colombia to work in the fields. Now, those visas were free, but you had to pay your way to Colombia, all the expenses, the travel expenses and everything to get there. And this cost some money. But there were some friends of the family that were rather wealthy. And that's how they answered the ad. They went to Warsaw from that place and they got the visas. And that included my mother's sister and her husband, my mother's sister Esther and her husband, and also my mother's brother Chaim, who had been married but decided to try it out by himself.
So Chaim left his wife.
Chaim left his wife in Poland, yes. But these people that helped them financially to get the
Transportation.
transport, the expenses, they had some businesses in that place, in that town called Krylov. So they called my mother and father in and they asked them to take care of those businesses. And they accepted. That's why we went to live in Krylov. So when the war broke out in 1939, we were living in Krylov, my father, my mother, and my mother at the time was 6 months pregnant.
Okay, Moises, you've told us about your mother's family. Where was your father living and what about his family?
Well, my father, as I have said before, at the time when the war started in September 39, he was in Krylov with us. But he had been born in Hrubieszów, which is 16 kilometers or 10 miles northwest of Krylov. Now, in September 1939, his mother was still living, although his father had died. His father died in 1929, but his mother was still living, and they had 5 children. The oldest one was a woman called Baile, who was living at that moment in a city not far from Hrubieszów called Krasnobrod. She was married and had 6 children. Then there was Chaim, my father, who was at that moment in Krylov, as we had mentioned before. Then there was Dovet. Dovet was also married and was living in a town also not far from Hrubieszów called Lashchov, and he had 3 children. Then there were the 2 youngest ones, who were Srulke and Yosel. They were the 2 youngest sons.
Your grandfather died in 1929. What did he do?
Oh, he used to be what is called a soifer. A soifer is a man that writes in handwriting.
He's like a scribe.
Like a scribe. He writes all the things that have to do with the scrolls. He writes the small pieces of parchment that go into the mezuzah, which is the
phylacteries and
also the phylacteries, the tefillin. And he was a very religious man. So this household was very religious when he was living. But he died, as I told you, in 1929. So when the war started, he was already dead.
What did your grandma, how did she continue to subsist?
She had a small store where she sold dry goods and small things for the home, like threads and needles and the buttons and all sorts of the small things for the home, and she subsisted with that. besides that, my father used to work, my uncles used to work, everybody used to work and cooperate into the household.
Moises, tell me about the relationship of Russia to Germany in 1939.
Well, they had signed, if I'm not mistaken, like around August of 1939, they had signed a non-aggression pact. This was signed by von Ribbentrop from the German side and Molotov from the Russian side. That's why they didn't move. They came up to the eastern bank of the River Bug, and that's where they stationed the troops. When Hitler invaded Poland, however, after that the Russians did go into Poland. I think they went up to like Lublin, maybe something, but then they talked again, they discussed the thing among them with the Germans, and they went back to their original positions on the east side of the River Bug. In September 1939, the mother, my grandmother, was in Hrubieszów, together with Srulke and Josel, the two youngest children. And she was very worried because they might either be taken by the prisoners by the German forces, or they might draft them into the Polish army. She didn't want either of the two. So she pleaded with them to leave Hrubieszów, but she decided that she would stay. She thought she was quite old and tired and she didn't want to move. She had passed, she had been in one war already, which was the First World War, and it didn't occur to her that this war would last that long.
How old was she?
I am not exactly sure, but I think she was around 55 or 56 years old, which today wouldn't be considered old at all. But in that time, it was rather considered old, and she thought that the war would end somehow very soon, and that she would she could probably stick it out and stay there, and when the war would be finished, she would return to her normal life, and everything would return to the normal life around her. So they finally accepted. So about these decisions that we are talking about, that was the first decision. Her decision to stay in Hrubieszów and not leave because of the war. That was the first decision. Her two youngest sons, Srulke and Josel, left to Krylov to talk with my father about this. They left on foot. There was no other means of transportation, so they left, and they came to Krylov and they talked with my father about it, and my father and mother, they accepted. They said yes, it's a good idea to look for refuge in some other place. So my father volunteered, and he did it next day, to go across the river and look for a place across the river on the other side when the Russian troops were, the Soviet troops were, to look for some shelter there. And he went there and came back with the good news that he had found one. He had found a blacksmith that was living not far from the river on the other side. And this blacksmith, Jewish blacksmith, had a house with 2 rooms. So they agreed that he would rent one of the rooms, he would take his family into one of the rooms, and that he would rent the other room to my father and all his family. Yes, for some price that was not decided in currency, but it had to do with this, oil and sugar and salt. It's a certain amount of it was like a trade thing.
barter.
Yeah, right. So they agreed on that, and my father came back with the good news that he had found a place to stay. So that's what they did. They packed everything they wanted to do to take with them. They lifted the boards, the wooden boards from the floor, and hid all the non-perishable things they could hide beneath the floor, and took whatever they could take, packed everything on a cart and a horse, and crossed the river to the other side.
Now, this group was your parents and Sarul and Yusuf?
Yes, my parents, Srul, Yosel, and myself. I was with them.
And Hannah?
Hannah and Hannah. Yes, yes, because she was my mother's sister, and the youngest one, and she was with us. Yes. Now, the crossing of the river was done on a sort of a raft that was called a prom. This was like a raft with a wooden railing on one side. Through that railing there was a rope going through the railing, and this rope was fastened to poles, firmly planted poles in each side of the river, so that everything went on the raft, including the horse and the cart and everything, the whole family with all the belongings, and you pulled on the rope, and this way the prom advanced to one side, or you could go back on it to the other side.
All right, Moises, you and the rest of the group went across on the prom, the raft. You lived with the blacksmith for how long? And then, Moises, your mother was 6 months pregnant. There were some medical needs that she had, and there was also, if I remember you mentioning, you had a rash that needed some attention.
That needed some attention, yes, that's true. And so they thought that they would someday would have to go to the bigger city not far from there, that is called Vladimir Zvolinsk. But before they did that, Yosel and Srulke, the two youngest sons, they thought that they would like to go back to Rubieszów to see how the mother was doing, and they wanted to see whether Baile and Duvet had come to live with her, because that was the original project. So they got with somebody a small canoe to cross the river, and one night they decided to go back to Rubieszów. They learned on the way that, first of all, on one side of the river, on the German side of the river, there was nobody. And on the other side of the river, on the east side, there were the Russians, the Soviet troops. But there was one guard that they took half an hour from one guard to the other to cross the same spot.
To do the patrol.
To do the patrol, right. So what they did is that they waited till the guard had left, and then they went and crossed the river. And they planned to do this for the way back also. So they did that, and they went to the mother's house, and they talked with the mother. They got some clothing because it was starting the cold season was starting already. They hid some other things beneath the floor again, and came back to where the rest of the family was, and they checked out that nobody had come to see the mother. I mean, the other two children had not come to live with the mother. So they did that, and a couple of days later, they did exactly the same trip again. In this second trip, they met with Dovid and his family that had arrived to live in Rubieszów with the mother. Okay? So they tried to convince Dovid to come with them to the other side of the river with his family, and he didn't want to do it. But finally he accepted to go with them, back with them together, and try it out, see what it looked like. And then he would decide whether he would stay or not. So he went back with them, and after staying maybe 1 or 2 days, he decided that he didn't want to do that he'd stick it out also. He'd wait till the war will be over back in Rubieszów. So he went back by himself. Yes, that's another decision. To this day, we don't know whether Baile did arrive in Rubieszów or not. With
That's
her
your
family.
sister, that's your father's older sister.
Older sister. We don't know. The only thing we know is that they all perished. My grandmother, Baile and the whole family, and Dovid and the whole family, they all perished probably in the Sobibor extermination camp, which is not far from Rubieszów. After that trip, these two young people, including Hane this time, went to the big city to see what it looked like. And in the big city, Włodzimierz Wolinsk, this city was called Ludmir in Yiddish. For some reason, I don't know what the reason is, but that was the name the Jews gave it in Yiddish, Ludmir. They went there, and there was my father's cousin living there. So they came to her house, and they explained where they were. They told her the whole story, and they said that my mother needed the doctor, and that I was also in need of a doctor. So finally, they agreed that the whole family is going to come over to this cousin, and they wait a little bit, then they go into the city to see what it looks like, and evidently they find the city. The city was teeming, literally teeming with refugees. It was swarming, how do you say?
That's it. They just the streets were filled with refugees.
They slept in the streets. It was terrible because everybody was coming to this city to
escape from Poland and the
escape from
Germans.
the Germans, right. So they saw all this, and they went back to Cuchnov, to the blacksmith, and they told the whole story. So they decided that they had to go to Włodzimierz Wolinsk anyway because of my mother and of myself, and they wanted to go to a bigger city anyway. So they decided to do that, but before doing that, Jocelyn Strulke wanted to go once more to Rubieszów to see the mother. So they picked up one night to go there, and before they went there, Shlomo, the son of the blacksmith, asked them whether he could go with them. he was a young boy, maybe, I don't know, maybe 18 or 19, and he wanted to have some adventure and take a look what Rubiezo was like, and maybe see how